Hey everybody, I'm Rob Childs, a Rapier Swordsman out of the United States, and today I'm going to talk to you guys on the topic of mixed weapon sparring. In this particular instance, we're talking about my particular specialty, that of the rapier versus a katana. Now, in order to highlight some of the do's and don'ts about that kind of a weapons matchup, I'm going to bring forward a video that was a matchup, if you will, that was conducted over at the school known as Ludus Ferocia. Apologies if I butchered that name in any way. But that is a school out in Virginia, and it is run by a gent by the name of Kai. He is the head instructor out there and the owner of the school. And he and one of his fellow instructors decided to conduct this experiment in order to, as they put it, to see how the rapier would do against a katana. Now, right there, you got to pause and take just a moment in order to recognize a couple of things right off the bat. And that one, that by himself is a Kenjutsu instructor and is a self-described himself. He is a student of the rapier. He's not really a versed practitioner of it. And his training partner as well is somebody that is a trainer in the different weapons of historical European martial arts, such as longsword, such as saber, and things of that like, but is not himself a rapier fencer or a teacher of the rapier itself. So you have to understand that right off the bat. Now, I'm choosing this particular video because both of them have good experience in their respective weapons, and they're both, in Kai's instance, he is going to be fighting against something that he's not used to fighting against with a katana in his hands, whereby his training partner TJ is going to be an individual who is not a rapier fencer himself by trade. So both of them demonstrate some do's and don'ts that I think should be taken into account whenever you are fighting rapier versus whatever. In this particular case, since we're talking about the katana, there are some definite things that I would do and definitely some things that I wouldn't do, and you're going to see that in this video today. Okay, so here you can see Kai is on the right with the katana, and his training partner TJ is on the left with the rapier. Right off the bat, the thing that I'm liking most is that they've got a good operating distance between them, but let's see how well they handle it and see what they do with it in this first exchange.
And boom, right there. You can already see.
Let's slow that down just a little bit because the reason I want to highlight this is Kai believed that this shot to his arm was a valid hit. Now, the problem that I have with that is you'll see his training partner reaches out there, lunges forward, and it's the start of a thrust. And his thrust ends up falling short because Kai makes good use of his measure. He steps back. His training partner TJ on the left there is not able to make contact with that thrust. And then TJ brings his sword down and touches his arm and kind of does a sort of draw cutting action with the last, 3, maybe 4 inches of his blade. That there in an actual martial context would do absolutely nothing to the Kenjutsu fencer's arm at all. A rapier is very good at the thrust, not so much at the cutting. And if you're going to get an effective cut with a rapier, you're going to have some good momentum going on that blade. The way that this particular cut was delivered was not falling into that category at all. It was basically a failed thrust that ended up coming into a sort of meager draw cut along the arm. Now, I don't know if you've ever taken a look at the cutting videos that use actual sharp rapiers against some target that was even covered just by a few layers of trigger cloth. That rapier is not effective at doing any sort of cutting motion. Surprisingly, that cloth was very protective against a cut from a rapier like that. So, when you're talking about cuts from a rapier, what you really need to be doing is you're either imparting a considerable amount of momentum if you're going to be hitting something like an arm, for example, which is going to impact bone, or you need to make sure that you're hitting the soft targets of the body that are most affected by a rapier slashing motion, such as if you were going for the throat, the fat of the belly, areas like that, the soft tissues that are going to allow you to get that effective cut. But slamming your sword against the full-on, broadside torso of your opponent, for example, that's really not going to do a whole lot, if anything at all. But in this particular instance, going for that arm, I thought it was good, but I disagree. I don't think that would have been a good cut at all from a rapier. The rapier has to be wielded in a decidedly different manner in order for that to be effective. So from that last exchange, Kai and his training partner immediately go into their next. And in this particular instance, Kai gets a really good hit on his training partner, but he makes the mistake of thinking that his training partner's some semi afterblow was an effective hit. But I want you to watch and see for yourself if you would agree with that assessment.
Of his point, and he was able to just shift it over and lean. So right there, we get a double.
Now, I called that a double, but let's go forward on that just a little bit there so we can see. I want you to watch and you judge for yourself in slow motion here. So Kai gets a really good beat against his opponent's rapier, sends it off to the side with no small amount of momentum added to it, comes in, makes his cut to his opponent's head. In a martial context, yeah, that's a fight-ending blow. But then you'll notice that his opponent brings his notice rapier's coming down and the tip just sort of, lands up against his collarbone there. There is no real good rotation going on that blow. It is just his sword coming back, and he just happens in the midst of the clash to touch his rapier to his opponent's shoulder and draws across there. Again, when you're talking about the torso of your opponent, the rapier is not really a good cutting implement for that. You have to aim for specific target areas if you're going to make a sufficient and lethal cutting motion with the rapier. In this particular instance, I would have called this absolutely completely in Kai's favor. This was an unequivocal and in my sense anyway, an undeniable shot that would have been in his favor, and his opponent would have been fallen completely short. So this next feature in this particular exchange, I wanted to point this out because it is something that I think is a mistake that the rapier fencer is making in fighting against the katana itself. So you're talking about these two weapons, and the katana has a much more rigid profile to it. It's definitely a rigid weapon, and with a rigid weapon, you are able to impart momentum in a way that a weapon that doesn't have that kind of mass to it is not going to be able to replicate. In this particular instance here, I want you to watch and see how the rapier fencer is holding his sword up right next to the katana. I mean, there's a lot of unnecessary blade contact going on. In this particular instance, that is a situation that definitely benefits the person wielding the katana. In this case, we're talking about Kai, because of the fact that I, at a moment's notice, with just a flick of the wrist, could impart tremendous amounts of momentum into his opponent's weapon. And the rapier, there's not really a whole lot that a rapier fencer is going to be able to do against that. And in that particular exchange, too, it ultimately does end up costing the rapier fencer a shot to the head. But I want you to watch and see how he's holding his rapier up there right next to the katana. And when you're talking about that kind of that kind of a position in relation to a katana, that's just if you're the rapier fencer, I highly discourage ever doing something like that. Not only because you've got a lot of unnecessary blade contact going on, and therefore you're communicating a great deal of information across that contact, but also too, you're putting yourself in a position of weakness because even if the rapier fencer knows that the beat is coming. You can't get out of the way of it. It's going to happen whether you like it or not. And that's, of course, going to open up an avenue for your opponent to take advantage, such as Kai does in this very exchange. But let's have a look and you can judge for yourself.
Continue on, and TJ's sitting here trying to probe with the point to find my weaknesses, and I'm trying to keep my blade in front. And right there, I get a headshot.
So there you see it. He ultimately does indeed. Kai ends up taking advantage of the fact that the sword is right there. He doesn't have very far to travel at all in order to move it out of the way. He smacks the sword aside. And there's nothing that the rapier fencer can do about that. You're going to see that weapon just go on a merry journey, and you're just going to have to wait for it to come back. But Pi, of course, does not wait himself. He goes in, makes a strike against the head, and then the rapier fencer, again, his sword comes back and just sort of lands against his opponent's arm. You're not going to get an effective cut that way. It's not even going to be something I think that would probably even break the skin. But nonetheless, this is a learning experience, I'm sure, for the both of them. Again, as a reminder, neither one of them is a steady practitioner of the rapier, so this isn't a mark against them. They're fighting in the way that their experience is lending as best as possible. TJ, who is the rapier fencer on the left there, is not a rapier practitioner by trade, so therefore I think he's ultimately doing a decent job in his experimenting. but he's experimenting with some experience that would be useful if he were wielding indeed, say, for example, a saber or a longsword, vice that of a rapier. In this very next exchange, it is Kai who subsequently makes the next mistake, which is holding his katana back towards his head. Now, in a kenjutsu stance, I've seen this many times in kenjutsu practitioners where they are holding the weapon back and away from their opponents. And versus katana against another katana, that is perfectly acceptable. It's got a tried and true history behind it. But when you're talking about facing against a rapier is a wickedly fast thrusting weapon, and in the hands of somebody who is indeed experienced, you're talking about a blinding attack that's going to be coming in faster than your eyes can follow. Holding your sword back here by your head, and trust me, I've had rapier practitioners who have fenced against me, and they've done these kind of um, a little unorthodox and off the wall kind of stances with their rapier, where they were holding it back away from their opponents. It didn't work out well. Let's just put it that way. The rapier is a wickedly fast thrusting weapon, and in a stance like this, in the rapier in the hands of an experienced practitioner, they are going to lightning fast go straight in. Now, in this particular instance, if you look at the way these two fencers are standing right now, the rapier fencer has an ideal situation in his court. All he has to do is take a step forward, and he's going to be plenty close enough in order to just simply rifle shot that rapier right into his opponent's face. And because we're talking about action versus reaction, action happens across a tenth of a second. Reaction phase happens across 2.5 times slower. It's 0.25 seconds. And that person who is receiving the attack needs a full quarter of a second in order to get through all three phases of see, process, and respond. But as is already mentioned, when you're talking about action versus reaction, action phase is 2.5 times faster than that of the reaction phase. So the rapier fencer is going to literally be able to lightning shot that thrust right into his opponent's face and then cover the line before his opponent's weapon even starts to move to try and parry or counterattack, whatever the case is. And because of the fact that that rapier is covering that line, he's going to be perfectly safe from that attack that's coming in as a riposte. So if you are ever going to be doing a matchup similar to this, if you are a kenjutsu practitioner or you just happen to be the fencer who's going to be wielding the katana, my strongest advice for you in order to keep yourself as safe as possible is to make sure that sword exists between you and your opponent. You don't want it back here by your head. You're going to want it out in front of you. So that way you can help to counter the rapier's speed by giving yourself sufficient time in order to respond to whatever it is that's coming in. Because remember, action, tenth of a second, reaction, full 2.5 times slower. So make sure that you keep that out there in front of you to give yourself the time you need in order to stop what you perceive as an attack coming in. This exchange, I wanted to point this out just because both fencers are doing something very smart. And it doesn't matter what weapon you're holding in your hand, this is something that you're going to want to do as a practitioner of a sword. You need to make sure that you're giving yourself time. And in this particular instance, you can see these two fencers are giving themselves plenty of time in order to try and be able to see what that attack is that's coming in on their opponents. In this particular exchange, Pai is actually starting to learn what his opponent's measure is, and therefore he's starting to be very smart about how far out he's standing. And when his opponent makes his attack, he's not leaping out of the way in order to get himself safety, but is rather just taking that small step back in order to buy the time that he needs. But there's something interesting that happens towards the end of this exchange, and I wanted you guys to see it for yourselves and see if you can pick it out and tell yourself what it is that you think that they're doing smartly.
I'm starting to understand his measure a little bit more, and as you can tell, I'm being able to back up in time. But you can barely see that point. If it wasn't for that stopper, you don't see the point at all. It's so fast. So,
So here's the reason I wanted to point this out. So you hear it in Kai's commentary there about how, if not for the fact that there was a stopper on the end of that rapier, you could not see that point at all. Now, here's the thing. When you are fencing against a rapier fencer, and if you've ever been a student of mine, then you've heard this God knows how many times. But when you're watching your opponent and you want to see what it is that they're doing, you do not watch the sword. Now, in this particular instance, because Kai is trying to track the sword, or at least it sounds that way from his commentary, that he's trying to track the sword with his eyes, he's giving himself a goodly amount of distance, so that way that translates directly to time in order to be able to see that attack. But if you truly wanted to be fencing at your absolute best, what you want to watch is not the sword, but you want to watch your opponent's body. The body is the slowest moving thing on the field, but it is also the thing that is generating the force, the action, the motion of the sword itself. If you're watching your opponent's body, that sword could be invisible for all you care because you would know exactly where it is at all times. For myself, I'm talking about how I watch the center of mass of the upper torso. I will watch and my eyes will rest right here. And what that does is using that as my center point, I'm able to see the entirety of the body from the top of the head to the toes. And that tells me when my opponent is moving, that tells me where the sword is going. And if you're really good at reading tells, and I'm telling you, everybody out there has them. Everybody's got tells. If you're good, you're watching for those tells because that is information. Those are broadcasts that are telling you what is about to happen before it happens. And let's say, for example, let's say for the sake of argument that your opponent has the absolute minimum of tells, right? They're not giving you any information whatsoever because of the fact that you're watching the body, when that body moves, it tells you everything you need to know about what the sword is going to do. That's what I watch for. That's what tells me where to go when I'm going to parry or if I'm going to counterattack, whatever the case is. That information is invaluable when it comes to you being a swordsman, able to fend off that which is coming in from your opponent. One of the problems that Kai mentions throughout the video as he's fencing against the rapier fencer is that the rapier point is able to change lines very quickly. His opponent, in this case, TJ, his training partner, is able to change lines whenever Kai is trying to close with him. And as I mentioned earlier, right, the body is the slowest moving thing on the field. So you've got to be able to move without those tells. You have to have really good footwork and, as the case is, take advantage of the timing opportunities that present itself throughout the fight. Well, in this particular exchange, and I really like what Kai does here because knowing that he's having a hard time closing with his opponent, he does something that is absolutely smart. It is absolutely the right thing to do here, in that you're going to see how he baits his opponent with a feint, which triggers his opponent to commit to the thrust. And instead of closing right away with him, Kai takes advantage of that and parries. He closes the line out first and then closes with his opponent in order to make his attack. But watch for yourself. I think it's a really, I thought it was a really brilliant execution.
This one's really interesting because I technically did move his blade offline, but
So as you see there, he baits and then he parries. I'm going to this up just a little bit there. So you see him, how he gets into it. He baits his opponent. And here you see his sword as if he was making an attack, committing to it, does not actually, and then swings in order to parry the incoming thrust that he triggered from his opponent. And now that he's got that line closed, he comes down on top of his opponent. Now, as mentioned before, the rapier is not effective at cuts. You've got to have some momentum in that blade, and you have to hit specific areas on the body in order to truly be effective in delivering that cut. After he's already been parried and then the blade coming back and touching Kai, again, in a martial context, that wouldn't have done anything to him. I would be very surprised if it drew blood, if anything at all, in an actual contest between these two weapons. But the way that Kai goes about getting the ability to close that distance with his opponent while his opponent's weapon is now effectively nullified, that was an absolute brilliant strategy on his part, and I think he executed that absolutely marvelously. For you fans of the mixed weapons matchup, if you plan on participating in an experiment like this for yourselves, if you're going to be the one who is wielding the katana versus that of, say, for example, the rapier, you need to make sure that you're taking advantage of the strengths that you have at hand. The katana, by and large, is going to be more massive. It's going to have more mass than a rapier does. It's going to be more rigid than a rapier is. And therefore, you have the perfect opportunity, the perfect implement in your hand in order to transmit a great deal of momentum into your opponent's sword, thereby knocking it offline and clearing the pathway for you. In this particular exchange, I have learned that he is able to do so. In fact, you're going to see it here for yourself. He is learning how he can smack that sword aside, and then he commits to the actual attack. But I want you to see for yourselves and see if you can point out what went wrong in the final last exchange. So here he's learned he can smack that sword and he can reach it and he can knock it aside. And then he commits to the actual attack.
And this one was a double.
Now, did you hear what he said? He smacked his opponent's sword aside, comes down with a cut on top of the head, but then he calls it a double. But I disagree. And the reason for it is such. If you look here, his opponent is standing in front of him. He's got his sword poised perfectly for him to be able to smack it aside. So guy comes in at first, smacks it aside, comes in for the cut, comes down on top of his opponent's head, and his opponent's sword, having been knocked out of the way as it was, it starts to come back down again because he's hoping that he's going to be able to get some sort of a hit on him. But that's not the case here. He just basically comes down on top of his opponent's head with the flat of the sword. Here you can see the C curve beginning in his blade there. It came down on top of his head and it's not point on, it's not edge on. In this particular instance, I did the smart thing and the effective thing of knocking his opponent's sword aside and then coming down with the cut on his opponent. Never mind the fact that in a martial context, Kai's blow is most decidedly going to be a lethal blow. But after you have delivered a blow like that, there's all kinds of question now as to whether or not his opponent would even be able to do any kind of an attack after receiving a blow like that from a katana. But all of that aside, remember when the sword is coming down and it's flat on whatever part of the body that you're hitting, that is not a valid blow. The rapier is not a lightsaber. It cannot hit on any side of the blade whatsoever. Now, um, I'm going to attribute this and allow some grace for the fact that, again, neither of these gentlemen are rapier practitioners by trade. Kai is himself a student of the rapier, and his forte happens to be that of kenjutsu, therefore utilizing the katana. So, in all likelihood, he probably, in the midst of the exchange, the fast action of that went on. He heard impact against the top of his head and thought, oh, my opponent got me as well. So, I don't fault him at all for that. Obviously, it's just a friendly spar and it's an experiment in and of itself. And he's using the best experience that he's got against the against his rapier opponent. But when you are yourself, when you're going to be that rapier fencer, right? You guys need to make sure that when you're making contact with your opponent, in order to best uh, exercise that experience and to grow your own experience as best you can, you need to make sure that you're paying attention to that edge alignment. You're making sure that you're paying attention to, did that point actually land on my opponent? And did I actually have some forward momentum on that thrust? Otherwise, you're going to train in these, what I like to call false variables into your style. And ultimately, and I would hope this is true for everyone out there, that we are training to be actual swordsmen, not just simply playing tag with a couple of pieces of steel. But I have to say, I enjoyed the video thoroughly. I think Clyde did a great job of improvising and bringing his experience to the fore. I think his training partner also did very well, considering that, again, rapier is not his forte. It is something that it's certainly within the realm of HEMA in which he practices, but since his job as the instructor is things like longsword and saber, I think they both did a really good job. I enjoyed the video, and I think a lot was learned in both when you're fencing against said rapier, but also what you can do when you are that rapier versus that of the katana. In conclusion, I would say this much. While this video was definitely entertaining to watch, and I think a great deal was learned as an experiment, if you really want to find out what would happen if this weapon was to face that weapon, or, in this particular instance, we're talking about a rapier versus that of a katana, what you're going to want to do is to have two very high level experienced players on both sides. The rapier fencer actually being someone for whom the rapier is their main weapon and they know a great deal about it, against someone who is also a kenjutsu instructor, as we had here, and someone who knows a great deal about it. That is how you're going to really be able to find out what does and does not work when it comes to what the strengths are and the weaknesses are of one weapon set versus that of another. You'll see videos like this all across YouTube. You're going to see the different weapons that are being brought to bear. And not in every case, but in a great many of those cases, I have seen that it is the weapon being pitted against another weapon without the subsequent experience backing up each one of those weapons. In this particular instance, I think that we definitely had some good demonstration of the Kenjutsu instructor. We had some good demonstration, even though he's not a rapier fencer himself, but still had some good learning opportunities that were being made here. But if you're going to be doing something like this, if you wanted to do a mixed weapons competition, if you're going to be doing a mixed weapons, just even as an experiment, your best results are going to come when both fencers are absolutely highly skilled in the weapon that they are bringing to bear.